bartend and I serve at private parties in Santa Fe, and I've been doing it for about 25 years. And a lot of people say I'm really good, except that I don't think Mrs. Mayfair is going to say that anymore. Because you see, I had this job with her this summer, and I messed up, and I messed up really big. You see, Mrs. Mayfair called me, and she said, darling, I heard from Mrs. Good up on the hill that you're such a fantastic server, and I'm having a dinner party with all my friends from Strasbourg and from London and from Paris, and I was wondering if you could come and serve. And by the way, for 12 guests, would you need an additional server? And I said, well, whatever you think, Mrs. Mayfair. And then she called me the second day, and she said, darling, this is Mrs. Mayfair again, and you know, the one that's having the party with all my guests from Strasbourg and from London and from Santa Fe, and I was wondering if you're going to remember to come. And I said, yes, Mrs. Mayfair. And then she called me the third day to say, darling, this is Mrs. Mayfair again, and I just wanted to make that confirmation that you're going to come to the party at my house with all my friends from Strasbourg and from London and from Paris, and I'm having an additional server, and I hope you can make it, and they'll be there up on the hill. Is that clear? And I said, oh, yes, Mrs. Mayfair. And so Friday I got there just in time to help Mrs. Mayfair heat up the frozen appetizers from Sam's Club. And then she suggested, darling, would you please put the appetizers on that lovely platter over there? You know, the English serving one. Oh, yes, Mrs. Mayfair. Yes, yes. And then Mr. Mayfair, he interrupted and he said, dear, I want to counsel you on the wines. I want you to use those glasses over there in that cabinet. I want you to use those glasses with these wines, and these wines with those glasses, and those wines with these glasses. Is that clear? And I said, oh, yes, Mr. Mayfair, absolutely, I got it. And then Mrs. Mayfair, she just turned around and said, dear, are you finished with her yet? And Mr. Mayfair was going to answer, but then the doorbell rang, and then we all looked over, and it was the additional server, Peter. And I recognized him because, you see, Peter always wears this fantastic red vest, and I have a little bit of a crush on him. And he works for this really great food caterer in town. And so Peter said, hey, Mr. and Mrs. Mayfair, it's so good to see you this evening. And, hey, kid, Penny, how you doing? And I said, oh, I'm just fine. I'm just fine, Peter. And Mrs. Mayfair noticed his vest, too, and she said, oh, Peter, that's a fabulous vest for serving wine. And, oh, shit, I don't do food, I do the wine. Peter's supposed to do the food, but I didn't say anything because I'm supposed to be a really great server, and so I'll just figure it out. And so I said, hi, Peter. And so Peter came in. Right away, Mr. Mayfair started giving Peter all the instructions for the wine, and Mrs. Mayfair kind of cornered me over here, and I could hear Mr. Mayfair going on, and so Mrs. Mayfair said, darling, go out on the patio and bring me the basil, please. Basil? Yes, Mrs. Mayfair. So I went out to the patio and looked, and all I could see was one little tiny, like wilting plant in a pot. And that's the basil, so I brought it back, and here, Mrs. Mayfair, here's the basil. Here you are. She said, thank you, dear. Now, look, I do want to tell you about the food. But first, I want you to remember, when you're serving the cheese, make sure you do it after the salad, and I want you to do it before the dessert. Is that clear? Yes, Mrs. Mayfair. Now, look, this is what I want you to do. I want you to take the bowl, and make sure you use these bowls, because they've been in my family for years. Yes, Mrs. Mayfair. I want you to put the bowls out, and then I want you to put in the tomatoes first. Do you understand? And don't worry about salmonella, because we don't have that in our house, because we had these flown in this morning, especially from California. Oh, yes, Mrs. Mayfair, that's wonderful. And then I want you to take the cucumbers, they're already chopped up, and I want you to put them on top of the tomatoes. And then I want you to take the soup from back there, and I want you to put that on the bowls, and then please, the sour cream is over there, but I want you to use just a dollop because they're European, and Europeans don't eat a whole lot. Yes, Mrs. Mayfair, I got it. Is everything understood? Yes, Mrs. Mayfair, not a problem. Mrs. Mayfair went out to the patio, and then Peter comes in and, hey, kid, it's a good thing you're doing the food. I'm going to stick with the wine. Mr. Mayfair, he's already changed the menu twice. Do you mind doing the food? Oh, no, Peter, not a problem at all. Good, good. Now, look, why don't you do the soup? I'm going to make another go around with the wine. I think they're done with the appetizers, and then you can have the fish. Not the fish, I mean, the soup already. Yes, Peter. So Peter went back out on the patio, and I got all the bowls, and I put them out, and I started, but then I thought, oh, I got to check the table. So I went over to the dining room table, and I looked, and I could see all of the salad forks, but I didn't see the entree forks. And I thought, oh my God. But then Mr. Mayfair came in, and he said, problem, Penny? Oh, no, Mr. Mayfair, I was just curious, because I can't find the entree forks. And, oh, well, let me introduce you to the fish forks. You see, these are fish forks. They have a special groove on them. Oh, okay, Mr. Mayfair, thank you. And then Mr. Mayfair went back on the patio, and by now I really had to get the soup ready. So I came over, and I set out the bowls, and I remembered, okay, first, the salmonella tomatoes. So I put the salmonella tomatoes in the bowls, and then the chopped cucumbers. I put the chopped cucumbers in the bowls, and then I thought, oh, the soup. So I went back there, and I got the soup, and it was the prettiest orange color, and I brought it back, and I poured the soup on all the bowls, and then, oh, yes, the sour cream. So I went and I got the sour cream, and I put little dots on all the bowls, and I was just about finished, and then Peter came back in, and he looked at me and he said, hey, kid, I think you better talk to Mrs. Mayfair. There's not going to be enough soup left. She likes leftovers. Oh, well, Peter, I think there's going to be fine, because Mrs. Mayfair said that her guests were from Europe, and Europeans don't eat a whole lot, just dops of this and dops of that, and that's why they're so skinny and we're so fat. And Peter said, all right, if you say so. Yeah, Peter, really. And so he said, okay. And so I finished the last two little bowls. But then Mrs. Mayfair came in. And then Peter says to Mrs. Mayfair, hey, Mrs. Mayfair, is there going to be a problem? There's not going to be any leftover soup. And what do you mean, no leftover soup,